Welcome to the digital podcast that explores how different organizations transform the way they create and capture value with digital technology. James, it's so exciting to have you on the podcast. I really look forward to having this conversation with you. PharmaLedger is one of my favorite projects, soon to be now it's an association, but soon to be something bigger. I do hope. I think it's one of those cases that actually showcase how blockchain can do wonders in healthcare. And I really look forward to talking to you more about this. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Maybe we could start by you introducing yourself, what you did so far, how you ended up with the PharmaLedger Association, but really interested also about you, the person.
Yeah, no, for sure. So my name is James Gannon. I currently serve as the Vice President of Quality, Trust and Safety for the PharmaLedger Association. So at least in that role, I'm accountable for all of our regulatory compliance, our data privacy, and I also look after a lot of our corporate governance and our kind of governance design for the association and the ecosystem as a whole. Prior to that, I've spent, I'm going to say, about 15 years primarily working in emerging technology within the pharmaceutical ecosystem. I've worked both with regulators, I've worked for a lot of big pharmas. I started my career in a very unusual place. I started my career as an actual manufacturing operator. So I joke that I'm one of the very few people that works in healthcare technology that I've actually made drugs. I've filled vials that patients have actually used. So I have a very kind of close connection to the real patient-facing piece. And that led me over the years to getting involved now in PharmaLedger. And, as you said, I think it's a big step forward, and I'm looking forward to, the future that PLA might bring.
Thank you. That's great. I've been following PharmaLedger for probably since just prior to COVID, because I bumped across one of the videos online, and then I started following the updates. And it was fortunate, right? Because during COVID, we were all in lockdown and there was a lot of webinars. So I got to know a lot about PharmaLedger and the ecosystem that's built around PharmaLedger. So, but I'm not sure how much our audience knows about that. So maybe we could start by maybe telling us a little bit about the PharmaLedger project, how it started before PharmaLedger became an association. Who came up with the idea? What were the key objectives? And I mean, I'm interested to also understand, obviously there's a lot of benefits coming from the technology itself, right? Building immutable records, self-sovereign identities while meeting some of the regulatory principles such as anonymity, data minimization, etc. All of those things that I guess GDPR tried to do, and a lot of healthcare organizations are trying to achieve, right? And I think blockchain, I think, sits right there in the center. But I also understand that there's a lot of challenges, at least within the pharmaceutical industry, such as, for example, enrolling patients for clinical trials. There's the problem of scaling, right? Because a lot of these clinical trials are done very much using study-centric recruitment methods, right? That are very difficult to scale. I want to understand, the objectives both from the point of view of the technology opportunities, but also, how this project really aimed at addressing some of the key problems or key challenges in the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah, so really, prior to even the PharmaLedger project starting, there was let's say a critical mass of enthusiasts, primarily at Novartis, who had been speaking about the potential opportunities for blockchain as a technology within the healthcare ecosystem. I'm going to specifically use healthcare because it's bigger than just pharma. Pharma has its own challenges, but there's also this kind of bigger healthcare ecosystem that exists around pharma. And, I was living in Basel at the time, and one of my colleagues at Novartis, Dan Fritz, who went on to be the project lead for the PharmaLedger project. We'd had a couple of conversations, about, oh, what could this technology be used for? Will it ever gain traction within the industry, and how could we kind of take it to the next level of viability as a potential technology solution for the pharma industry? And Dan and Marco, Marco was the technology architect behind PharmaLedger, the project. Dan and Marco really kind of took this idea that we'd had over, lunches and beers, and they said, well, these pharmaceutical companies, we have a huge interaction with the European Commission through the Innovative Medicines Initiative, where we have these research projects. And generally, these research projects have been focused on pure healthcare topics. It could be drug delivery systems or, patient interactions, very kind of scientifically driven projects. But they're open calls. They're open calls where anybody with sufficient expertise that can build a coalition or a consortium around a project proposal can propose a project. And really, that was kind of the genesis of the PharmaLedger project. And Novartis, led by Dan and Marco, started gathering this consortium around this concept. And eventually they met Xenia Beltran from the University Polytechnica of Madrid, who was involved in the Life Science Institute there. And they then came on as the public partner lead. So when you're applying for these large European Commission projects, you need both an industry partner and a public partner really to move forward with your project. And that was then the genesis of the initial ecosystem that was built around the PharmaLedger project. And really the goal there was, it was very much an R&D project. It was to come up with potential use cases within the healthcare ecosystem for blockchain as a technology stack. The cryptocurrency element and everything else was never part of the equation. It wasn't about, having an ICO and having tokens and trying to make money off of it. It was really about that kind of pure and simple, what are the use cases that could potentially have a huge impact from this technology stack? The project was then, endorsed and began with both public and private partners. I think the final figure, we ended up at 30 partners within the consortium, which is a huge achievement on its own. There was a very large consortium. A huge amount of funding was put in. And the team then started coming together and they identified these 8 use cases. And as you mentioned, those 8 use cases went from everything from clinical trial recruitment, way down at that early stage in the pipeline, right through to finished goods traceability, how do we track drugs through the life cycle of supply chains, and then right out into, more kind of conceptual use cases, particularly at the time, of things like personalized medicines and IoT devices, and, what potential use cases around patient interactions and patient collection in a privacy preserving manner were there. That project ran for many years, 3 years in total, and it was very successful in performing that kind of R&D element and coming up with viable architectures, viable outcomes for those 8 use cases, and really setting the future for what this could be from an ecosystem perspective.
Mm-hmm. So it was driven by a pharmaceutical company first and foremost, and I mean with the interest and the excitement that came with blockchain, that I guess was driven by some of the academic colleagues, right?
I would say that the idea came from staff that happened to be at a pharmaceutical company. If we look at the actual project phase, it was very much co-led. So, within these, or at least within our project for sure, Novartis as the industry lead and UPM as the public partner lead, they were equals in every way, shape, and form. It was really co-pushed by those 2 partners together. And, it just happened that the original idea happened to come from industry, participants, but it could have very just as easily have come from anywhere else.
And we will get more into the later stages and the maturity stages of the ecosystem, but I just wanted to understand the original project was for 4 years, right? It was funded by the
Correct.
EU. And I guess in the beginning, it was more of a, okay, let's experiment with this and let's see where it takes us prior to then setting a bigger agenda.
Yeah, and that's the way that these IMI innovative medicines initiatives projects run, is that they are focused on that kind of R&D phase. They're not intended to stand up anything that's long term, or they're time bound to work on a specific research
Mm-hmm.
topic. And the outcomes of these projects is something that has to take into account the future sustainability of those ideas, but they're not intended usually to spin out into operating companies or anything in any way
Mm-hmm.
like that. They are really focused on that conceptual R&D
That's
phase.
great. And I understand that the whole idea was built around what you call a minimum viable ecosystem, right? Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, so that's a terminology that we've now placed onto something that kind of was created organically. So, like, one of the key elements that we learned over the research phase is that when you're building multi-stakeholder networks like this, the networks are not viable, both from a technology and from an ecosystem perspective, unless you have the required participants on board. And when I say on board, I mean involved in the running of them, involved in the definition and design, involved in the governance. You really need to take that ecosystem approach. And, we've now kind of moved on and we've tagged on the minimum viable piece to that. Because whenever you're standing up a new use case or a new product area, for example, one of the things that you need to do is who needs to be at the table here? You need to be able to say, if this is something that is patient facing, for example, like our first app EPI is, do we have patients involved in this? Because when you're building this kind of more democratized network, as opposed to a more traditional software development process where there's a commercial company who is building something for sale. That's not really how blockchain networks work, and it's particularly not how our blockchain ecosystem works. It's about having the right people at the table to ensure that you're designing, building, and deploying everything in the right way with the right people involved.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I understand the concept, and as you know, I'm writing a book that is exactly building on that idea of an ecosystem. Um, and absolutely, without having all the parties collectively agree on some ground rules, right, and setting the joint value propositions forward, you can move ahead. I mean, that's the starting point, and so I understand the
Yeah,
point
yeah,
of a minimum viable ecosystem, with viable essentially referring to this idea that everyone needs to agree on a common set of governance
exactly. Yeah,
rules, probably also defining some of the incentives, which I guess we'll go through them later on in the talk. And can you also explain who the various ecosystem actors um, are, or where? I don't know if you lost some in the process, but who are they, and in terms of the roles that they play in this ecosystem?
yeah, and really, we've done a good job of keeping them. To be honest, I think we have a huge amount of consistency between the stakeholders that were involved in the project phase and those that have come to join us in the now association phase, let's say, and we can bucket them up into four areas, let's say. So we have the pharmaceutical industry. So, again, in the project phase, we had many major pharmaceutical companies involved and some smaller ones as well. Then we have the patient organizations. They can be represented in different manners. So some are represented through formal patient organizations. Some are represented through more transnational patient representative bodies that kind of pull from different countries and different areas of expertise. We have the technology partners. So, of course, you need technology solution providers to be involved in this from the build and design point of view. And then we had academia. So we had a number of research universities and applied life sciences institutes involved. So, like, that's kind of your core building blocks, let's say. There's, depending on each potential use case, you might need to bring in additional partners, as SMEs, as experts for that individual use case. So to ensure again that you have that minimum viable ecosystem for that exact use case.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And just one clarification, I guess this being a European project, you depended on essentially European regulatory frameworks, right? I mean, because otherwise it would have been very difficult to manage probably different jurisdictions in terms of patient involvement, patient engagement, different regulations around drugs and different technologies, devices that may come along with it. I guess that was a strategic decision, right, to keep it within.
To an extent. So while this was a European funded project, we did have stakeholders from all over the globe, including non-European countries. And when we think about designing our core governance processes, we did 100% take an international approach. So we also have a concept internally for when we've moved from this project R&D phase into more of an operational phase with the association. We have this concept that we call minimum viable governance. So we like this minimum viable prefix at the PLA. So when we look at minimum viable governance from our design perspective, we did take into account, okay, well, what jurisdictions are we going to be working in primarily? What are our launch countries for potential use cases? And we bring those in from then building our governance and our regulatory controls internal to the PLA. So we have particularly we've taken a European, we look at the US, both from an FDA perspective. We look at some Asian markets, such as Singapore. We've taken into account a lot of the Singaporean data privacy and healthcare legislation. So we do have that kind of framework that is modular, where we have this kind of core multinational governance framework from a regulatory point of view. And then we add on for specific markets what additional controls that we might need in order to enter those with our products.
Okay. But I guess at the same time, though, things like how clinical trials are executed and operated, I assume there would be differences even within the European Union, right?
Yeah, and this is where we've taken a very pragmatic approach of, as part of the research phase, you're also researching what are those requirements. From an international point of view, not just focusing on Europe, is there a set of common denominators amongst those regulatory frameworks? If so, then you build to those common denominators. And then on a use case by use case basis, you will be able to then take into account the variables that each individual market may bring across. Because if I compare, for example, US clinical trials regulation versus European clinical trials regulation, you probably have a 60 to 70% overlap. So you build for that 70% that okay, is common between the two. And then you're able to build in just the 30% delta between the two for specific use cases that are going to target one market or the other.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I have another question about the technology. I understand that you're using a vendor-agnostic infrastructure that is built on open
Yes.
source technology. Um, can you say a little bit about that? Again, I guess that was a strategic decision.
Extremely strategic. So both in the project phase and now in the association phase, in our bylaws of the association, we have mandated that we operate on an open source vendor agnostic process. So this is not about, maybe the more traditional way of approaching blockchain projects is, you choose a chain that you want to build on, and then, you utilize the functions of that chain. That's not how we build products. We sit in that kind of platform layer above the chain, and we build all of our products in a chain agnostic manner as much as possible. In reality, okay, we build in an EVM compatible manner, but not on top of a specific chain. So for example, you're able to then take on a use case by use case basis a specific architectural decision on, I'm going to go with a private quorum chain versus I'm going to go with a public layer 1 chain, or I'll go with Polygon as a layer 2 chain. We really don't want to push our use cases and our products into, some type of PharmaLedger endorsed solution. We really are a bottom-up organization from an architecture and a design governance point of view, where each use case needs to be given the freedom to be able to choose their own architectural solutions for the problem that has been presented to them. And again, coming back, we have that open source piece. Anything that is developed by the PharmaLedger Association, under the auspices of the PLA, and this was the case for the project phase as well, is open source, primarily under an MIT license. And, that is something that we're very strongly passionate about from a governance and organizational design point of view.
Yeah. And I guess that layered modular approach enables, as you say, different applications, but also from the point of view of an outsider, this really sends the signal that this is not driven, this is not operated, this is not owned and operated by any big organization, pharma or otherwise. This is an open source ecosystem
Yeah.
that enables a modular approach to developing solutions that would accommodate different needs depending on whatever the use case is, right?
Yeah, and really, our goal is to provide a venue for that collaboration with the appropriate guardrails and frameworks that are required by the fact that we're operating in healthcare. There are regulatory requirements out there. There are expectations from certain national bodies around data protection, patient engagement, patient rights. So really what we want to do is, we use an analogy, or particularly I use an analogy. I like this analogy of PharmaLedger is there to help build a railroad. Okay. We want to help you lay the tracks. We'll tell you the gauge of the tracks. We'll help you with the signaling systems to ensure that the signals are designed correctly. But what we do not want to do is come along and be the operator of the trains that go on that track. We want our partners, we want our members, and we want the broader ecosystem of commercial players, startups, big companies, small companies to come along and operate on those tracks and, be able to utilize all of the value that comes from that standardization of, we all know how we're interacting. We all have a set of standard, ways of working. We know that from a regulatory point of view, we're inside the boundaries of how we're supposed to operate, and that we have a level of safety and, understanding on the expectations there. But what we do not want to be is, the actual operator of the products that sit on that platform. We just want to deliver that space and venue for people to come together and collaborate on the core aspects.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So from 2016 to today, you went through various stages in developing the PharmaLedger ecosystem. Can you discuss those? And I know you came a little bit later than that, but as much as you can tell us about the history while highlighting some of the key advances, the key challenges in meeting the original objective of PharmaLedger.
Yeah. And just for your listeners, so I was involved both at the start and at the end, and I took a big break in the middle of the PharmaLedger project to do other things. So really, we can bucket it up into maybe 4 major phases, let's say. So there was that initial discovery phase when the project started of what are the use cases, because it really was a blank piece of paper that we started with, finding the areas that blockchain could be of major value addition was really that kind of first phase of discovery. Once you've completed that and they'd identified the 8 projects, the 8 use cases within the project, then the next phase was really the ideation and the design of what can the technology stack look like for those 8 use cases, and also what synergies and harmonies can be found between the use cases. So for example, if I look on the conceptual left-hand side of the process of making and delivering drugs, it's clinical trials. So we had at least 2 use cases in the clinical trial space. So, you want to see what harmonies then you can have between those 2 separate business processes, but that could have a lot of interaction because one is consecutive to the other. For example, if you're doing clinical trial recruitment and you're identifying potential patients for trials, and we also have a product on e-consent, okay, so those 2 products should have a lot of overlap and should be able to be integrated very well. So then, we moved through a long period of, 18 months, 2 years then of really building demonstrators and building proof of concepts to meet those identified use cases. And this is really then where I came back in when we realized we had some extremely viable candidates here where we had built, demonstrators and proof of concepts that had a potentially massive impact on the industry and the ecosystem. So there was a real push, in kind of the last year of the project phase to say, how can we keep this going? Because like these European projects, they have a defined end date, and your funding stops then. And to be honest, most of those EU research projects don't do anything after that. They publish their research, and then everybody goes back to their normal day jobs. The research is incredibly valuable and it get used in different things, but you don't generally leverage that ecosystem that you've brought together to deliver that project to do anything else. So really what we decided was that we wanted to treat the sustainability phase, is what the commission calls it, as a project almost in and of itself, and treat it like, how can we make sure that we don't lose the momentum and lose the teams that we've built around this research project. So I joined again at that point, and I was one of the architects of coming up with the PharmaLedger Association, which is the body that has taken over the research now that the project has ended, and looking at how we designed the governance and the operation model of that as a not-for-profit association.
That's great. And as you say, I mean, this is true. The fact that the point that a lot of these projects finish and then there's no sustainability. It's not just blockchain, even though there's a huge literature on blockchain, especially in healthcare, and everyone talks about this, that there's great projects out there, great use cases, but they never move past the pilot phase. But this is also true for a lot of the Horizon 2020 or some of the other large European projects. Unbelievable research, lots of publications, nothing gets done after that. Everything just shuts down, which is a shame. And I wonder whether
massively so,
right? And just if we could stay on that point, I don't know how much you can comment on this, but I wonder whether this is a European or even a UK issue, because I know my colleagues in the US, I think, have a much better understanding of taking pilots to scale and creating from those pilots successful companies, right? There's so many spin-offs. And I don't know whether it's the venture capitalist culture, the investment opportunities, or whether there is policy and the market-driven policy around new innovations, whether it's in healthcare and manufacturing, whether it's robotics or whatever. There's always this drive to take products to market, whereas in Europe and in the UK, it's always, oh, this is fantastic research, let's do more research and development. But then when it comes to commercialization, or in your case, okay, it's not commercialization, but at least sustaining the efforts, there seems to, we lose momentum. I don't know if you can comment on that.
So like taking my PLA hat off for a moment, and as somebody who has lived both in Europe and in the US, and I've run startups in Europe and the US, there's two major factors that I personally see. The first is the capital market in Europe is quite weak comparatively. When we talk about investors, and particularly venture capital investors, if you compare the terms, the check size, and the speed of movement of European investors versus their American counterparts, it's worlds apart. Like if you have somebody who has a great idea and wants to raise venture capital seed funding, in the US, it's something you can do in a weekend. In Europe, it's something that will take you 6 months to a year and has due diligence that is more appropriate for a $15-20 million mergers and acquisitions deal rather than a seed check to start an idea and see if it's a potential opportunity. And then the other thing is more cultural, I think, personally. There's a huge culture of risk taking in the US versus a huge culture of risk aversion in Europe. And I think that factors into the willingness to even take that risk of moving into, a high risk startup and, taking that risk of this may or may not work out. I think that Europe culturally is just less comfortable with that. And it results, I think you're entirely correct, in a smaller cadre of startups willing to take that risk. And because of that, the US really has a higher level of failure, most likely, but due to the sheer volume of people willing to take that risk and the support of the VC ecosystem there, they have a larger volume of success at the end of the day.
Yeah. And as you say, a lot of these European startups, even the UK ones, end up in the US, the ones that are willing to take that risk.
Yep.
Otherwise, they just struggle
Yes.
for a decade or so before shutting
Yep.
up, if they're lucky, right? It's a shame. Anyway, it's a podcast. It's another podcast. Maybe we can have one.
Exactly. I'm happy to come back and talk about that for an hour.
So I understand that there are multiple products that came out of this process, and can you describe some of those? I mean, you mentioned already the e-consent, the EPI, which is, by the way, my wife works in the pharmaceutical industry. She's a quality assurance person, and I hear a lot of cases of batch recalls or having to send data and information to the patient, to the pharmacies, and you cannot do that because it's a physical product. You need to return it, etc. Whereas with an electronic product identification or information package, right, you can immediately send that through the supply chain, and it updates, and everyone gets an update on their mobile phone potentially. Anyway, I'm rushing ahead of myself. I mean, maybe you can describe some of these products. I'm fascinated by that particular use case, the EPI in particular, and the clinical trials. But anyway, please.
And you can see why EPI was the first one that we chose to launch. But yeah, like we came out of the project phase with, I'm going to say, 8 use cases. So the first 2 were around, clinical trial recruitment. So I did, matching potential patients to clinical trials, which is something that is actually incredibly complex, even though it sounds quite simple. Identifying somebody with a certain disease profile or a certain medical profile and matching them to potentially opening trials. It's actually a very complex problem. Then once you have actually found that trial, how do you gain informed consent for that person to begin participating in that trial? Again, it's actually still a very manual process, often done on paper forms. So again, looking at digitizing that process. Then the next one after that, and I'm not going to go into too much detail on every single one, but around clinical supply chain. So, when you're manufacturing drugs for these clinical trials, it's obviously not at the same scale as your full commercial manufacturing. So again, it has unique challenges of, how do you actually look at tracking and tracing those drugs from clinical supply manufacturers to the investigation site, to the patients, particularly when you start looking at more advanced therapies such as cell and gene, where, you can even get down to a 1-to-1 patient to batch size. And the supply chain traceability concerns are very, very important there. So I was on the clinical side. Now, once you move beyond clinical, you get into the more traditional supply chain challenge that I think, blockchain has excelled in so far. So we had another use case around finished goods traceability. So that is for commercially manufactured drugs. How do you trace them from the moment that they, get manufactured through all the third-party logistics providers, through all of the delivery companies, to a pharmacy, where they eventually then get dispensed to a patient. So again, those supply chain networks can be incredibly complex, particularly when you start looking at markets such as the US, where between a drug being manufactured and a patient receiving the drug, you can have 5, 10, 15, 20 even, stakeholders in that value chain, as it goes from location to location and stakeholder to stakeholder. So again, mapping that out and being able to trace that and getting that visibility on that supply chain is a huge challenge for the industry. We did a lot of work on that. So then conceptually, the patient has the medication, they have their box of drugs. How do they get the information that they're supposed to have? Traditionally, we get that through our gigantic paper leaflets that everybody knows. Everybody rarely reads, even though there's actually incredibly valuable information on it. So again, we have a product which we are launching right now, and it's the first product we've brought to market, called the Electronic Product Information. I know it's a very exciting name. That very simply digitizes that leaflet, and using the blockchain as a resolver layer enables you through a single application to scan the medications of any company which is onboarded onto the PharmaLedger network and get those electronic leaflets. Now that we have that in hand, and patient is able to look at their leaflet, they're also using an app. So another big challenge for the industry is anti-counterfeiting.
Yeah.
So how do we as patients know that this drug is real? So we have another use case around adding anti-counterfeiting features, either to the existing EPI app or through other venues. There's a lot of other national health systems, for example, that could have their own applications. Being able to expose that API to them to integrate anti-counterfeiting features into their products. And then we have the last one, which was more of a kind of a conceptual research area, because this is something that's still emerging in the industry, is around personalized medicine and IoT. So we're moving beyond the traditional data collection, during a trial where you go in every 6 weeks and you meet with the investigator and you tell them how you're feeling, et cetera, et cetera. We are moving to an ecosystem where increasingly we have medical devices that we use on a daily basis. That can either be something as simple as your Apple Watch, which is actually a certified medical device, which many people don't know, right through to something like a blood glucose monitor for people with diabetes. So again, how do we, in a patient-centric and privacy-preserving manner, ensure that the data that is being generated from those devices is available for research, is available for use to improve drugs? What is the framework that potentially could be built around those devices? So those were kind of the use cases that we came out of the project phase with. We have now inherited those as the association, and on a slower scale, I will admit, but still our plan is to eventually launch all of those use cases as open source products.
Okay. And are there any plans to commercialize these products, or are you offering the IP on a license for others to commercialize?
So this is another beauty of some of the governance decisions that we have made at the PLA, is we are a non-commercial entity. So all of our products, once ready, are licensed on an MIT open source basis. We charge no license fees currently, and currently have no plans to change that. Again, on a use case by use case basis, there may be certain fees involved to leverage a network which PLA, for example, is managing the infrastructure for. But because of our non-profit element, it would be purely on a cost recovery basis. So from a commercialization point of view, we actually have no right and no incentive to seek commercialization of that intellectual property on PLA's behalf. Because again, it comes back to this concept that, from the railroad analogy, we want to lay the tracks, and all we need to do is make sure we have enough money from an operational point of view to keep laying those tracks and bringing everybody together. We really want the outside ecosystem to then come along and build the products that would sit on top of that. So, if you're a startup and you want to come along and build a new way to detect counterfeit medicines, brilliant. You build your product, maintaining your own IP, and you have a commercial model around that, and come and integrate with our ecosystem. Use our APIs, use our standard processes, and really be able to have that access to the platform and the ecosystem that PLA is building without having to sacrifice your own ability to commercialize your own product. And we really want to be that kind of open ecosystem player where commercial companies and non-commercial players are able to come together and operate on their own terms, but without sacrificing the open and interoperable nature of the core platform and the core interoperability that sits at the core of it.
That's fantastic. And I guess what you are providing is access to those ecosystem actors, as well as the research and development that has taken place
Exactly.
yeah.
And the technology standards as well is a big piece.
Standards.
So like if you have such a diverse ecosystem that you have so many technology players alone, for example, coming together, standardizing how all of those actors work together and how the technology components are going to work together is really that key piece of ensuring that it's a sustainable ecosystem that can grow and can scale.
Yeah, yeah, and that's fantastic. And as you said, I mean, one of the use cases on the EPI and as a mechanism against fake drugs, which is a huge industry, right? I mean, it's I don't know, probably in the
Huge.
trillions, if I'm not mistaken, globally, right? There's fake drugs flowing around different markets, and it's a huge problem for healthcare systems around the globe. So if a startup comes in with an idea to address that problem, that could potentially be a huge market.
Part of the value proposition of how we work is exactly that. Is, as somebody who's ran startups in the healthcare ecosystem, gaining an understanding of architectures, gaining an understanding of the needs of particularly big pharma players is a big challenge. What do they expect from us as a small company? Doing that work through somewhere that's ecosystem driven, like the PharmaLedger Association, where when you come along and you make these proposals and you're able to see the architecture is there, it's open. There's no paid access to see how to integrate with the EPI app. It's there. It's open for you to do. And also when you come along and you want to say, hey, how are we going to do this exact integration? Across the table from you at the meeting will be the pharmaceutical industry's architects and technology SMEs who are going to be the ones implementing your product potentially. So you get immediate access to that kind of advisory gut check piece of, okay, we're all on the same page how this is supposed to work. And it really gives you that kind of availability to all of the stakeholders, both on the pure technology, how do I interact with this API, and also culturally almost, how am I expected to interact with these stakeholders?
Yeah. In addition to helping startups and new companies in this space, there's also a huge effort to helping the end user, right? And
Yeah.
in some of your webinars, you make reference to a public good, right? Can you discuss
Yeah.
the vision behind this? What are the key? I guess you've already commented on the the IP licenses and not commercializing and creating a public good for the companies. But can you discuss the vision, especially for the end user?
Yeah, and let's take a step back from maybe the more corporate governance and legal aspects of, IP rights and, specific governance designs, and what do we want to do as the PLA? And, this is very much my own interpretation, but I think it's shared amongst the staff, is we want this to be a step change in how we operate technology within healthcare. Full stop. We don't want this to be a small niche exercise where we choose certain use cases that have a high return on investment for certain players or anything like that. We want to change how we approach building technology and very much change it to be patient-centric. And that's a big change for the ecosystem. Being able to do that in an open, transparent, and collaborative manner is very difficult. But we believe that the impact of doing that successfully would actually change healthcare ecosystems around the world. And that's the public good piece. If you can change a healthcare ecosystem for the better, personally, I'd be happy if I could help 5 or 10 patients, deal with their disease better. That would make me feel good. But through something like PLA, you have the opportunity to impact thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of patients and other end users. Particularly the patients are important to me. It's a very important part of the ecosystem. But we're also making people's jobs easier. We could make, product recalls, more manageable. There's a lot of ancillary benefits that you get from a healthy, well-organized operating ecosystem around this. And technology is a multiplier for that. We've seen that across the industry in general, that when you're able to work on things like digital therapeutics, it opens up whole new areas of being able to actually help patients in the way that they want to be helped. And we have a younger and younger ecosystem of patients out there who want to, they're digitally native. They want to interact with their healthcare providers, with their drug manufacturers in a digitally native manner. And that's a change that's happening in society anyway. And if we can be an accelerator for that process, I really do think that from a career perspective, personally, that will be amazing. Being able to say that you have done something that has genuinely brought a public good, and it's not just for your own commercial benefit. That comes back to the not-for-profit element of this. We're not doing this so that we can make money. We're doing this because we believe that it will have a positive impact on society. And really, that's the core of why we're doing this experiment and trying to do it this slightly unusual way. It's not a normal way of doing things.
Yeah, and perhaps now it's time to talk more about the actual governance structure, because as you say, this is a great vision. Creating a public good, enabling patients, empowering patients to be digitally native with their use of technology to benefit from different types of healthcare services, whether that's being able to better understand the legitimacy of a product that they have bought, i.e., a drug, or to take part in clinical trials, or managing their own personal condition through personalized medicines. All of the use cases that you mentioned, right? I mean, are commendable. I mean, this is fantastic, and well done for getting this far. But obviously, there's a lot of collective action problems, right? This is which
Yes.
sits at the core of any ecosystem, right? So I want you to maybe talk about the governance structure that you are putting forward now that you have become an association. How do you manage
Yep.
the different ecosystem actors?
Yep. And I'll preface this with I'm not an attorney, but I'm going to talk in some lawyerly
Okay.
terms now. So, first of all, let me just briefly set out what we are from a corporate governance point of view. I think that's important to kind of baseline us. So, we are a Swiss-based Verein, or an association, where all of our members have one vote. So, it's a very democratic process. Our General Assembly, which is, our core decision-making body from a, strategy, budget, those big corporate governance decisions are all taken by the General Assembly of the association, where, as I just said, everybody gets one vote. Now, who is that everybody? All right. Who are our members? We've identified, 4 classes of members, let's say, with different structures around that. So first of all, we have what we call a patron member. So a patron member is a member of the ecosystem who is lucky enough to, have a large amount of cash flow and is willing to pay a large membership fee in order to join the association as a leading member. And, for that, they will get a guaranteed seat on the board of directors and a guaranteed, input into the strategy and the operations of the association. We then have standard class members. Standard class members are, again, those who have the capacity to pay for their membership fee. They're mostly commercial organizations. And we have a sliding fee scale. So if you're less than 100 employees, the membership fee is about 5,000 Swiss francs per year. If you're over 100,000 employees, you'll be paying about 100 or 150,000 per year. For that, you get a right to run for 5 board seats, which are set aside for the standard class members. So it's an election process, and you would have the right to put your name up for election into that process. Then we have a membership class for public partners. So this is primarily for our NGOs, our organizations that work around the healthcare. We could talk about, publicly owned hospitals, for example. So these are really those kind of non-governmental organizations that are key players in the ecosystem. For those, we charge no membership fees. You still get that right to vote in the General Assembly, and we have 2 board of director seats set aside for that public partner class. Then finally, we have a dedicated member category for our patients. So our patient organizations also have 2 board seats set aside for them. So, we are really making sure that those patients and NGOs, even though there is no fees associated with those 2 classes, they are still fully represented and have full voting power, both in our General Assembly and in our board of directors. So from that pure corporate governance point of view, it's a very cooperative and equally designed corporate governance design, let's say.
Okay.
Now, there's a second phase, right? So that's our kind of organizational governance on one hand. Now we have the second thing of, okay, we have these amazing use cases. How do we build them? This I think is more your collective action point of view. So what we've done is we've split our use cases into two phases. We have a project phase and a product phase. On the project phase, it's really about getting us to the point of, are we ready to launch this as a commercial product, or non-commercial product, I should say. So it's taking it from, there's this concept of technology readiness levels, which some people may be familiar with. TRL 1 is where you have an idea, but that's all you have. I have an idea that I think is good. In our project phase, we work from TRL 1 to TRL 6. TRL 6 is that we've built something and we've validated that, yes, this concept, this technology that we've built works in a lab setting. So not out in the real world yet, but within a controlled environment, we've confirmed the technology works. So that's our project phase. Then projects can graduate into products. That's when there's enough of a business case, enough of a maturity, and enough of resourcing and, critical mass behind that project for it to become a product of the association. That's where then we come along, and particularly I come along with a lot of this regulatory piece. How do we ensure that this is, documented correctly? We have the right system lifecycle documents. We have done all of our testing to meet our regulatory obligations, and we're audit ready for a regulator to come along and say, how is this built? Is it built to our regulatory standards? So those are products that then get launched by our members into the market. This comes back to the thing of, the association is not a central body here that runs the network. The network is run by our stakeholders. On our blockchain networks, we don't even run nodes. We are not active participants. We are that coordination body. So once a product is ready to be launched, we then hand that over as a qualified package with the PLA stamp of approval on it to say, okay, this is ready to go. It meets all the regulatory expectations. It's been designed and built as per our requirements. The market is now ready to take that and implement it and operate it.
Okay. I mean, all of this is great in terms of structure, and I understand the point about, project versus products, and what you're doing is primarily coordinating, but you don't take ownership or responsibility for any of the commercial products that will fall into someone else's hand. They will be responsible for it, so they have to manage it, to govern, so the collective action problems will fall on their lap. I guess the questions that I have around this is, having different stakeholders, such as the big pharma companies, right? I would assume that many of them would want to have control over the data for obvious reasons, right? There's IP protection, but there's also return on investment over research and development. So a lot of the clinical trial data, for example, if I focus on that use case, would be used by the pharmaceutical companies to identify new studies, to repurpose drugs, to develop new ones, etc. Right? So if they participate on the PharmaLedger ecosystem, they're essentially giving away much of that control. This is what I want to understand. This is what I want our viewers to understand.
Right. No, and this is a key element of that. We are the coordinator. So when I talk, for example, about, building that railroad, each of the pharmaceutical companies that when they come along to run their own trial, they're going to operate their own train on that network. They don't need to share that train with another pharmaceutical company, for example, because they're in control of how they use those train tracks. All we're doing is setting out the signals. So there is an element of collective creation when we come together and say, how does this all operate? But because we're not then mandating that you must use, for example, the PharmaLedger application to run your clinical trials, we're saying here is a PharmaLedger platform for you to come along and connect your own systems to, or build your own application on top of. We're staying away from that kind of top interaction layer and really focusing on those interoperable platform layers, so that we're not ending up in a situation where we do have perverse incentives for people to try and control the process, because it's actually advantageous, and we primarily try and choose use cases where the advantage of using a blockchain or a decentralized platform in general, to be honest, it doesn't even need to be blockchain, that there is a force multiplier by having all of those stakeholders on board. Take, for example, the finished goods traceability. Okay. Any individual pharma company has and, could develop their own traceability for their own products. But then when you start going down the chain and you get a one-to-many relationship of, let's take a major transportation provider. There's a major one in the US and there's a major one in Europe. They're then going to have to connect with every single pharmaceutical company that runs their own finished goods traceability platform. If everybody is interconnecting to a single platform, privacy preserving, so that there's no visibility between those partners, unless you are an authorized trading partner of pharmaceutical company 1 to logistics provider 1, then you start to get network benefits and network effects coming out of it, of everybody collaborating on top of a single platform. Now that builds a technology challenge, because you need to be able to build that platform to be privacy preserving between only certain parties, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not about moving to a paradigm where everybody can see everything. It's about using the technology advantages of a lot of blockchain technology or blockchain architectures to be able to do these things collaboratively, but while in a privacy preserving architecture.
Okay, I see. I mean, I guess the point is about, getting hold of that data, that because it's all about the digital data that is being exchanged on a blockchain infrastructure. That's what's valuable for a lot of these companies. As you said,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of them can probably build their own platform, but they're coming on to you because of the scale, right? So the scale is attractive.
Yes.
And then the data that is being exchanged while preserving the anonymity, right? But
Yeah.
it is that data that then becomes valuable for running additional R&D and potentially product development. So my question is really about, okay, so if they run their own platforms on top of your PharmaLedger ecosystem, how are they able to then benefit from the data that is being exchanged with the rest of the ecosystem actors, right? Wouldn't they want to get access to that?
I think conceptually, in a legacy approach, you would be entirely right. So that, for example, is the business model and the proposition of many commercial players in this ecosystem. That is a product and revenue driven model that is required if you're trying to be commercial here. Really, with the PharmaLedger ecosystem, we are taking that ecosystem approach. The benefit and the return on investment is the access to the ecosystem players and those stakeholders that will be part of those networks, rather than the data that actually flows on it. A lot of that actually comes down to simplification. The cost of simplification when you're trying to do it on your own is huge. The cost of simplification when you're entering an existing network and an existing ecosystem is exponentially less.
Mm-hmm.
So the more people that come onto the platform and come into the ecosystem, the cheaper it actually gets to own, operate, and deploy these simplifications that would drive internal business savings, essentially. So again, finished goods traceability is such an easy use case to show. If you do not have to compensate and pay, the 200-300 logistics providers that you may work with, because they're already there on the platform, then there's a huge just immediate ROI to use a collaborative platform like ours, even though you might not get as much data value, because again, you're just going to see what you're able to see. The operational efficiencies you get from that multi-party, multi-stakeholder network almost build the ROI on itself.
Okay, now I get it. And in that sense, then you are acting as a digital transformation agent. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that, there's a huge, as you said, there's a huge cost of establishing interoperability between the different actors in a supply chain, right? Like the finished goods example that you said, right? If you require every single stakeholder in that supply chain to develop and implement and adopt the particular technologies that are required to manage, the product, right? Then it just becomes a huge transformation project. But what you're saying is, if they join the PharmaLedger ecosystem, they immediately benefit from the technology standards that are already there. And then they can start to develop whatever products they want individually with their partners without having to worry about those interoperability challenges. So in a sense, you're acting as a digital transformation agent without necessarily being an agent individually for each one of those.
Exactly, and that's a really great way to phrase it. And like, you can give the example, I've thought about this one before, of let's take a rural pharmacist, right? And over the next few years, there's a big push for digital transformation, and all of the big pharma companies will want to be able to interact with them directly to, ensure that, the medication is not expiring, that it's being dispensed to the right patients, etc. Can you imagine that you're that rural pharmacist and you have to manage 15, 20, 30 applications, one for every company that you interact with? And then you also need to have another set of applications to interact with your wholesalers, another to interact with distributors. Imagine using a platform like ours. You have one application. You would have your PharmaLedger Pharmacist app. This doesn't exist. This is just a concept, by the way. You have your PharmaLedger Pharmacist app. And in that, you're able to do all of your data interactions that you need to with the pharmaceutical companies. You're able to see the current delivery status of your next batch from DHL. You're able to see the cold chain monitoring of that specialist cold chain drug that you had to get for that individual patient. It becomes then a portal that simplifies your life and also has then ancillary benefits as you go along that entire value chain back to the drug manufacturer. That, I think, is what that key transformation agent piece is. By default, that would make life easier. And when you make life easier for the implementers and the end users, you will find that those benefits will then be taken up by other people further back in the value chain, because they see that it's an easy win for them and they're not making their end users' life more difficult or more complex.
Yeah. And based on that, then you onboarding, the more stakeholders you onboard on the PharmaLedger ecosystem, the more valuable the PharmaLedger ecosystem becomes for everyone else, right? So my next question is, how do you do that? How do you bring more ecosystem actors on the PharmaLedger ecosystem so that then more and more, so it's economies of scale, right? It's economies of scope. And there's the network effects that you mentioned.
Yeah. So that's the current challenge that we have right now. We're a young organization. Our first staff were only hired in January of this year, and we're really trying to build that membership base. And it's really by, opportunities such as this podcast, to get our message out there that there's a wave of change coming, we believe. And we are open to anybody who wants to have a conversation with us. We are just beginning. There's a lot of use cases, there's a lot of ways of working, and there's a lot of opportunities that we haven't even thought of yet. And, we want everybody to come along. We have designed our membership structure and everything else to be very accommodating to all actors in the entire value chain and, everybody in the ecosystem. And we're putting the message out there to everybody that we can that, come along and help us with this journey. It's a journey that's just starting. And if you're able to get involved now, then you're able to help us set the strategy for how this is going to look in 5-10 years from now. You can be that original builder on the ground and really set the frame for how this is going to work for the next 10 years.
So my final question, and I know we're a little bit over the hour. I hope you're fine with that. What comes next for decentralized technologies for pharma and the healthcare ecosystem more broadly?
So I think there's really two big things that are going to happen. Is we're going to see a lot of standardization, both driven by PharmaLedger and by other players as well. Like, I don't want to claim that we are the be all and end all for everything, but it's really about agreeing ways of working. I think we've had over the last 5 or 10 years in blockchain and decentralized ecosystems a huge amount of experimentation and a huge amount of, value creation and value loss in general. And I think what we're going to see is increased standardization of how do we operate together, how do we interoperate together, and how do we start focusing on true business value. And when I say business value, I mean both from a patient perspective, i.e. increasing patient satisfaction, and also from an enterprise perspective. It comes back to that thing of looking at simplification of business processes is possibly the most boring value proposition you can have, but it's also probably one of the most important. And I think we'll see a lot of work on that. And then I think, a tangential thing that will happen in the ecosystem around healthcare blockchains in particular, I think we're going to see an increasing adoption of open source in general. And I think that's going to be a big change. That was something that was changing already before PharmaLedger came along. And I think it's something that we will accelerate. And, that will also be transformative as well. I think, when you have these decentralized creation mechanisms like open source, where you're no longer, relying on a single vendor with a certain set of capabilities, I think that, has exponential impacts across the entire technology ecosystem as well.
That's great. James, thank you so much. This has been really insightful, and also it helped me understand some aspects that were unclear. So thank you for clarifying and for being quite elaborate on your responses to my questions. PharmaLedger and the PharmaLedger Association, the ecosystem behind it, the technology and the governance, I think is going to push the boundaries of not just pharma, as you said, but digital innovation in healthcare. And I really want to see PharmaLedger in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years, doing wonders. So please keep in touch.
I plan to, and thanks for inviting me on board. It was a great hour of my time.
Thank you, James. Thanks.